Welcome to the Whole Farm Podcast, brought to you by Chonex, where we explore soil health, nutrient management, and the systems that help crops and farms perform better over time. Each episode features conversations with growers and industry experts focused on practical insights you can apply in the field. Whether you're managing nutrients, building healthier soils, or looking for data-driven ways to improve outcomes, this podcast is built to support real decisions and real results.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Whole Farm Podcast presented by Chonex. I'm here today with a very special guest, and I have Les Riley, one of Chonex's sales agronomists who's doing a great job tracking over and seeing different progress we're making in the field. And so, Les, I'll let you take it away and intro our special guest.
Yeah, so we've got Russell Hedrick with us today. Russell and I have known each other for a number of years. I don't really know how we met. It somehow through Regen Ag circles, through some mutual friends or something. And we talk periodically about some of the stuff he's doing. So Russell is a first generation farmer in North Carolina. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about himself, and he's got his fingers in a lot of different things that I think would interest farmers around the South and across the country. So Russell, one thing that's pretty interesting, when I first came across you, you were doing that video from like 2014 with Ray Archuleta and them about adopting cover crops.
Yep.
I think it was called Farmers Undercover, and I watched that. And so, in a lot of people's mind, we have guys over here that are regen ag oriented, and then guys over here that are kind of high yield guys. And you've somewhat shown that to be a false dichotomy. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into cover crops, and then how you went from there into holding the world record on corn yield.
It was kind of a funny story. I always say that God looks after the innocent or the stupid, and I'm not innocent, so maybe he's looking out for me just in a different way. But it was all grace, happenstance, whatever you want to call it. We started looking at farming. We started talking to local farmers, and we couldn't afford some of the equipment for conventional right off the bat, so no deal was kind of a fit for us. And then I ran into the NRCS, DC, Lee Holcomb, learned about cover crops, and all we were trying to do was eliminate winter weeds and winter erosion. That was it. And then, you stumble forward into, Ray Archuleta and David Brandt and Ray Stiers, and you start learning about nutrient cycling and building soil biology and all these different facets of different, managements in regenerative ag. And it was really probably 5-6 years before we had even a minute understanding of what was going on. And we started luckily setting our baselines all the way back in 2013. So, this year, this will be our 11th year, that we can continually see what practices affect soil biology or weed pressure or nutrient cycling in the plant. It's really helped us hone in what we used before corn and what we used before beans. And so we're really looking at that scientific method that, David Brandt, Ray Stiers and them, they didn't have the technology that we do now 40 years ago. So with all the monitoring and mapping and testing methods that we have now, there's no reason that my generation in ag can't do a better job than what the previous one did. That's kind of been our motto.
Was it 2022 that you set the world record on dryland corn yield?
Yeah, 21 we set the state record in beans, and 22 was corn.
And that was 450 something bushels, is that correct? Something like that.
459 and some change, yeah.
And you are not you're not in the Midwest, you're not in the Mississippi Delta. And if I remember right from our personal conversations, that field that you set the record on was one of the worst fields you had before you started working on the soil biology, and your organic matter went through the roof. And didn't you tell me that year was a drought year in your area and county average was like 100 bushels?
So the year that we set the record, yeah, we went through 2 really bad dry spells. I think they might have been classified D1 or D2. It wasn't as bad as what this spring has been. You have the yield potential there, and that's some of the stuff that we picked up from David and some other guys. Is the yield potential is there. You just have to keep it. And looking at water holding capacity and all these different things, yeah, we've really turned that ground around in the last 12 years.
You and I talked on the phone right after Damon Mason was interviewing somebody about the importance of scale and how scale was what was going to save ag. And not Damon, but his guest made the statement that he's found that 500-acre farmers just generally aren't good businessmen, good farmers. It's primarily 10, 15,000 acres. How many acres were you farming the year that you set the world record?
About 1,100.
Yeah. So and you average anywhere from 750 to 1,500. So you're not a big farmer. You just focus on doing what's right on the land you have, correct?
I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think smaller farmers are better businessmen than big farmers because I don't get the cut in seed cost, chemical cost,
Right.
input cost. I think the smaller farmers are making every dollar count so that they actually have a decent income, to be honest.
You've got your farm, and then you've got soil regen, and you started a drone company. But before you did that, you've got this little thing called Regen Mills, and so you're doing some value added stuff with bourbon and with flour and grits and things like that. Tell us a little bit about how you're getting more value out of your crop than just selling it in the commodity market.
So we started out with probably 5% of our acres in non-GMO or open pollinated corn. It was not easy to build the markets. It wasn't this huge, like, available access to extra capital. But within the first 3 years, supplying distilleries, non-GMO corn's $10 a bushel, our open pollinate is $30 a bushel. Then we started getting into Regen Mills, which travels around the country, goes to the farm, grinds up grits, cornmeal, flours. They can bag it as well and use our branding if they want to. But a bushel of grits is about $450 a bushel.
Yeah.
So you don't have to sell a lot of grits to really see a huge income.
And if a farmer is interested in doing something like that, he can just find Regen Mills online and look at what y'all are doing.
Yep.
Correct?
Yeah. They can go to agsoilregen.com or Regen Mills.
And then circling back around, and Michael, you can jump in whenever you want, but I think we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what you're doing with foliar feeding of biologicals and how that's really helped kind of take you to the next level. But in addition to farming and having soil regen and Regen Mills, and we didn't even really get into you being a whiskey maker, but let's talk about your drone company a little bit. Tell me how you got into drones and a little bit about what you're doing with drones that may be different than some of the other efforts out there. And then I'm going to turn it over to Michael and let y'all get into some of the foliar and biology.
So 2021, we started using drones. Couldn't get, the applicators to come out and do the custom work on the timeline that we needed. So we decided to, purchase one for ourselves. Ran into some issues with that because, we couldn't get software updates or a hardware update or, things that we needed to fit in our scale of American ag. And this time we were also working on this AI program for foliar feeding. And the company that built our AI algorithm software also had about 60 software developers and technicians down in Georgia. And we were able to contract with them. And so 2024 is when we really launched Revolution Drones. And we started looking at, first building the software and then, making it compatible with the hardware. And, by luck, we were able to partner with another company that was based out of Brazil that has a bunch of manufacturing experience. And they've really helped accelerate us in understanding manufacturing and tooling. And so we're going to be launching our American-made components and drones September of this year. Right now, the drones are currently being built in a factory in Brazil. I was just down there at the factory the last 2 weeks, and now we'll be onboarding here to the American-made parts and the American software. The end of this summer. Well,
I'm gonna now shut up for a few minutes and let let Michael and you discuss a little bit more about what you're doing, particularly with foliar feeding and what we're doing, and how there might be some things we can learn from each other, and also help what Michael likes to call regen curious farmers that I think we can help really improve their soil health and et cetera. So Michael, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Les. Russell, it's good that folks hear what your background is, because ultimately, you've made it with the acres you have. You're doing different things. You're helping lots of folks in different capacities. You're helping a lot of farmers get premiums for what they're already growing, and also jump hurdles like custom apps. I'll get into my kind of custom application story later, but you mentioned 2013 was kind of setting your baseline, and I think Les kind of set me up nice, because I want to hit this regen curious conversation first, because you've really been at the cutting edge of a lot of these conversations related to changing your practices and thinking outside the box. And some people probably said, Russell, what are you doing? Like, how I've heard some of these people say things like that. And so when you started in 2013, really setting your baseline for where you are now with your fields and where you set the world record at in 2022, what were some of the biggest learning lessons? Maybe if you have 2 or 3 that you could share along this 10-year, this decade worth of baseline to where you are now. What does that look like for you, Russell? What would you say is the couple big learning lessons along the way?
Man, y'all might get some haters on this podcast if I really start diving into some of these secrets now. Just forewarning you here.
Well, don't share trade secrets for you now.
No,
Russell.
no.
Just back to learning things, and so we'll commit. If people get some business, we'll make sure we share.
It's not a trade secret. Lesson number 1: when I wanted to become a farmer, I watched everything on YouTube that I could. I mean, you got to go back to 2011. And, YouTube was really where the information was, that was cutting edge before TikTok and really Facebook ramping up and Instagram. And, we were always told you put X, Y, and Z of NP and K, and you got, A of yield. And the one thing that I have learned is our agronomy system, even as efficient as we are on a per square foot basis in this country of growing food, it is outdated. It is a dinosaur. The universities are heavily entrenched in that understanding and knowledge. And, you could tell them the sky was blue and they would argue that it was green, because, Mulek 1, 2, or 3 is green and Bray is pink. And, there's nothing other than those tools. And those tools were developed in sugar sand in the 40s, 50s, and 80s. There's not a single farm operation operating today that's multi-generational that operated then that has the same operating procedures, the same operating nodes. But our most expensive input as farmers is still viewed from 80 years ago when we had open pollinated corn. And number 2 would be the way that we determine the 14 nutrients that are needed was done in 1936. And they sterilize soil and then put nitrogen on one pot and not the other. And if the plant grew and made grain without it, well, it wasn't essential. And, once again, we're rolling up on 100 years of that premise. That's premise number 1. Premise number 2 is the soil is actually alive. When we started looking at the Haney test, I was like, what's a CO2? And when I talked to Rick Haney about it the first time, and he said, this is your microbial activity, it respires CO2 out of the soil and we can measure it. I was like, holy cow, man, you're going to get a Nobel Prize for discovering this. And then Rick told me, sadly, no. And he handed me a book from 1892. We were studying this in 1892, but didn't have the technology to do it fast enough and replicate it and put it over large scale agriculture. And now we can measure CO2 in a matter of minutes and make a fertilizer decision in minutes. So that's premise number 1, premise number 2. And I'll wrap it up with number 3. You can put all the fertilizer you want in a piece of dirt, and you're never going to push the yield barrier past what is microbial available. If you don't have, like, the PLFA testing that we did in 2013 versus 2026, I can see fungi breaking down phosphorus. I can see saprophytics breaking down potassium. All of these different biological entities are what's actually feeding that root zone in that plant. And that's the mindset. I'm not a purist. If guys need to level a field, till it. If you don't need to, don't waste the money. We're trying strip till out for our 2nd year now, and there is some ground that strip till is better than no till because I don't have soil aggregation. There's a lot of different things that we can do as farmers that are outside of the neat box that the university recommends. So you may get some hate for me saying that.
No, we were ready for that already. All good. We've built this podcast to really teach folks about, some other testing. And you just said that you did a PLFA test in 2013. I had never even heard of a PLFA test until probably 3 or 4 years ago,
Yeah.
South Georgia. So, and I've been around agriculture a long, long time. And so, I think that shows how far ahead of the curve you are. So when you look at where testing is going right now, Russell, I know you've been involved with some companies that are doing kind of next level, even forecasting kind of nutrient demand curves. Tell us about what you see on the near term of where this testing is kind of going.
Right now, let's take plant tissue. Plant tissue has been around for over 50 years. We have an American standard. And the problem with plant tissue is it said you were either high, sufficient, or deficient. Well, that's great. Where's the management decision? Like, that is why we started working on this AI program, a subset of 50,000 samples across the country, because sufficiency ranges in tissue sampling hasn't changed in, once again, 30, 40, 50 years, depending on what lab you're running it at. And just because my corn, a lot of farmers don't really dive into tissue sampling because 3% nitrogen in a V4 plant that weighs 16 grams versus 3% nitrogen in a VT plant that weighs 150 grams is a huge difference in 3%. And the mentality of what farmers have been trying to use that test and understand how to use that test and affect those ratios, 1 pint of potassium acetate at V4 is going to be a huge change in potassium versus that same time at that VT, just because of the plant growth. And we're taking a percentage of that plant, so 3%. Well, parts per million are the same. You just divide by 10,000. And, that's why we really got into the AI protocol. And then the AI protocol showed us another huge flaw in agriculture is we're applying nutrients at the wrong time. Like, when we started getting above 300, above 350, above 400 bushel yields, it's because we were paying attention to the nutrient curves. And modern agriculture has said peak nitrogen demand for corn is between V6 and V10. And everybody looked at the big, huge peak at V10. Well, if we ground apply nitrogen, it has to go in the soil. And we'll all agree with the university on this one. Nitrogen has to go through a cycle, and it's done by bacteria. So that means, one, we have to rain it in the soil. Then we have to have the water for the microbes to convert it. And then the number one element they got to have, carbon. So if we don't do that whole process, and that nitrogen isn't available starting at V6 on that whole ramp up to V10, then you miss the whole window. You've wasted your money. That is more of a yield limiting factor than the nitrogen itself.
Man, that reminds me of, like, if I only had to drive forward with only looking in the rearview mirror, Russell. That's what that reminds me of.
And then there's ratios there. So between V6 and V10, if you want to grow 400 bushel corn, you have to get 175 pounds of potassium in the plant in 14 days. Even in my most biologically active soils, I can't do that. And that's where the drones came in. That potassium acetate is the most available form of potash for the plant. And we can go out there and make a foliar pass, go back in 2-3 days, make another foliar pass. And these are, pints, quarts. If we have a really huge deficiency or drawdown, maybe a half a gallon, so they're economical. And that's how we're able to push the yield without breaking the bank and really still looking at what is that return on investment going to be, and is it paying for me to make these passes? Because every farm I have doesn't grow 400 bushel corn. We've got 2 farms with that potential to really peak out above 4. We've got some that we can peak above 3. And then I've got some marginal ground that if we grow 150, 175 bushel corn, that's a good year for us.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and go there, Russell. So the drone conversation, where on just the yield potential front, you mentioned the V6 to V10 kind of window as far as pushing potash. What is your kind of, experience, I guess, with pushing past that point into reproductive growth, whether that's a bean conversation or corn? We can kind of look at it 2 ways. And how does that relate to what you've done with the drone?
Okay, so if you want to start at the very beginning of the season, the number one yield limiting factor, I've been to 46 states and 13 countries now. I see this all over the world in the United States. Number one yield limiting factor, iron. Farmers, the biggest nutrient need for both corn and soybeans is iron from VE to V4. And if you're missing that iron window from VE to V4, you've already cut yield. Then you move into the next biggest uptake, which on corn is going to be that nitrogen and potassium going up at a 1-to-1 ratio between V6 to V10. And then the lowest hanging fruit that I think most farmers miss is from R2 to R5. We still have 50% of sulfur, 50% of zinc. We still have 60% of magnesium, and we still have 40% of copper that I can put that in a drone for $5 to $6 an acre, and that's easily seeing a 5 to 10% increase in our yield at the end of the year. I mean, we're determining a lot of yield at that later reproductive stages that most farmers, they put a fungicide on at VT and they go to the lake and hang out on the pontoon boat. So, when you're talking about corn, if you can affect a 10% yield on 200 bushel corn, that's 20 bushels. And, just take 450 corn this year. If I'm spending $5 or $6 to get that $90 an acre, that's really low hanging fruit.
That's incredible. What kind of other foliar tools other than micronutrients have you investigated, kind of seen success with over the past decade, Russell?
Success, few, tried all of them. We've used a product called Fish Head. We foliar sprayed that. Fish Head has worked pretty good in furrow for us. It's also worked on a foliar pass as long as we get rain, within a day or 2. There's another product, in-soil algae. We've ran that in furrow and foliar. A lot of different natural plant growth regulators and biological enhancers in that product. We tried another product that's actually sitting beside of me here while we're doing this podcast, and it's made out of salmon. It's a ground up salmon, and it's supposed to stimulate biology. We're trying that one this year. Compost teas, vermicompost extracts, like IMO systems with indigenous organisms, liquid litter. I mean, you name it, we've tried it. Anything that we can do, if I can spend $3 to $5 an acre and cut 20 or enhance yield, that's how we're going to make money in farming. Because right now, with input prices the way they are, some of the basic agronomy stuff just isn't paying off.
Yeah, that's definitely a pretty lively conversation. That's a pretty good way to turn people sour pretty quick, is talk about agricultural economy and all the things that go with that. But I really do love what you said about foliar, because I do think that in the next 5 to 10 years, foliar is going to get a lot more importance put on it, because I think we're going to have to be a lot more efficient with our nutrients, our ground applied nutrients. And, I don't really think that we've talked a whole lot about, writing foliar nutrition into fertility programs from, we'll say a USDA NRCS perspective. And I think we could be going there pretty quick. So,
well, to give you an economical example, so our smallest drone that we sell is a 20-gallon drone. The biggest one we have on the market right now is 40 gallons. That 20-gallon drone is doing 600 to 800 acres a day. The 40-gallon drone, we're getting 12 to 1,400 acres a day. That's competing with ground rigs.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing for us is I am probably a perfectionist with my corn planter and my bean planter. If we don't put it right in the ground, it's not going to be right all season. And the thing that made me the maddest is when I used to hire a co-op to come out and spray, if they ran over a whole row of corn for the entire length of the field because they couldn't drive straight, you start looking at how much money did you lose driving that ground rig. You go through a bean field, and our averages and university averages are fairly close, but we're 0.1 or 1.5 to 1.7 bushels of loss of beans. And that's even if you run the same AB lines with the most sophisticated auto steer system. Well, at $10 beans, that's $15 to $17 an acre per pass. I can run this drone for $5 to $8 an acre.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm already $10 ahead or $7 ahead running a drone that doesn't drive over my crop that I just spent all that money to buy seed, fertilize, and plant.
Wow. I've never really thought about it that way, Russell. That's really good to know.
We talked about it offline a few weeks ago. It was only high volume product that you didn't think you could replace a ground rig with a drone. You could possibly do all your spraying with a drone.
I would agree with that, Les. I mean, you can do high volume spraying. We can do 100 gallons an acre if you want to, but if you're going to do it efficiently, if you're looking at putting down your atrazines, some of your white chemistry where you want above 15 gallons per acre, that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard to do. And then there are a few chemicals that do not have aerial application yet. So instead of, we've seen farmers this year, instead of buying a $500,000 ground rig, they bought a $100,000 tow behind sprayer with, 60, 90 foot booms, and did their burn down with that, essentially parked that, and then they've switched over to the drone for their, the rest of their spraying. Because we can do herbicide spraying with a drone, you just have to pay attention to how you set that drone up, because we can have a CV value as good as a ground rig with a drone, so we don't have to worry about drift if you set it up properly.
Russell, here's my next question. And man, you got a lot of things happening on the farm. You got drones, you have, foliar AI analytics and forecasting happening. How do you keep up with everything? What kind of practical advice would you give somebody that is, maybe getting started, that's starting to really want to push, wanting to do a better job managing things, try some new things? What kind of organizational wisdom would you impart to them?
Oh my. I always challenge farmers to say, if you can't take 5% of your acres, and I'm not saying it has to be one thing, but 5% of your acres, and try a new foliar pass, or try a biological in furrow, or a different type of nutrient management. If you can't do that and your farm survive, I'm not being ugly when I say this, but you're already too far gone to make it in ag. You've got to be able to do your own research on your own farm, because I picked up things from people from here all the way to Alameda, Kansas at Michael Thompson's. And I brought it back to my farm, and I tried it their way, and right beside of it, I modified it a little bit to see if it would work better my way. And the results that I got on my individual farms, I picked my worst farm, a couple in the middle, and my best farm. and it gave me 4 replicated samples across every kind of dirt that I'm going to see on my operation. And that gave me the outcome that then either it passes and it gets more acres the next year, or it failed so horribly that we move it out of the program. And that is really how you dial in how hard can you push your ground, what products are going to be best suited for your environment. That's how we learned with PGRs. PGRs, we started out with 5 acres. I tried to talk the local co-op into selling me ounces of a PGR I wanted to try, and they sold me a whole jug, which ended up lasting on the farm for like 2.5 years before we got enough acres to really use even that one jug. And now we run that PGR on every single acre. If you're in the South and it's hot and it's humid and, sweat's rolling down your back, then those plants aren't going to be comfortable. PGRs are one of the ways that we mitigate stress on our farm. Foliar feeding helps us mitigate that stress. And, it really does help us decide how are we going to progress on our acres and really what stays and what goes.
Man, that's awesome. Les, I'll turn it over to you. And
we've covered a whole lot of ground. Tell me about you selling whiskey to all those people in North Carolina.
So 2013, got a phone call about our grain quality. My family back in the day, not anymore, made some bootleg moonshine. Started partnering with a distillery called Foothills Distillery, Tim and Zach, and we started with moonshine. Then we decided to make the first bourbon in North Carolina since Prohibition, so we started using our grains to make bourbon. That's kind of really changed. I mean, there's bourbon, whiskey. Started working with other distilleries like Old Nick Williams. So we're working with several different locations, and now Foothills, and it's a good market to be in. It's not like they're buying 2 tractor trailer loads a day like you would see out of Tennessee, but if you can add an extra $10 to 1,000 bushels, well, that's 10 grand for the same good corn that you were growing to begin with.
Yeah, and that before Michael wraps it up, that kind of transitions into, you mentioned that they asked you about your grain quality, and so a lot of people would like to get more for the grain, but I think the approach you've taken, where you improve your soil health, therefore not only you're improving your yield, but you're improving your quality of grain or your quality of your product you're growing, and that's something you can demonstrate and test. That opens doors for getting more value than just selling a commodity. I think a lot of people kind of want to jump over and get a premium for their crop. One of the things directions I think ag is going to go is we're going to be selling differentiated product. A lot of the world, they nutrition test, and they can demonstrate how their farming practices are improving not only the yield but the quality of their product, and they get a premium for that. So I think that path is something we can take from this, is not only improving yield and efficiency, but improving the quality of the product we're growing, so we're not selling just a raw commodity. And Mike, I'll let you take it from here.
It's really good. It's really good, Les. Russell, we've never ended a podcast like this, but you're the perfect person for this. You're one of the most fascinating growers in the country. I really appreciate you jumping on with us. But I want to ask you this way. If Russell Hedrick had a bumper sticker, maybe 2 bumper stickers, okay, what would you put on your bumper sticker? It could be any sort of farm mantra. It could be anything that you've done. We're not talking about a resume. We're talking about a bumper sticker. So what would you put on there, Russell?
Man, I don't know. I guess first thing that came to my mind first bumper sticker would be farm hard. We spend, I don't know how my wife puts up with it. She still loves me and kisses me goodnight when I come home at 2-3 o'clock in the morning. We definitely put the most amount of effort that we can to grow the best quality food for people to have. And the second thing would be pass it on. David Brandt spent countless hours on the phone with me telling me about stuff that he tried, and it saved me headaches. I wouldn't be here today and at the advanced stage that we are, if it wasn't for the guys like David Brandt, Ray Stiers, Nathan Louder, John Pickler, even Curtis Furr here in my home state, I'd call them up and say, hey, I watched a YouTube video that purple top turnips are great. And I still remember to this day on a phone call with Nathan Louder, he said, if you do that, your row units are going to bounce like they're on a trampoline going across the field trying to plant in a purple top turnip. So, our biggest thing is we love coming on podcast and doing the TV show that we do now, so that we can give that education to other growers. So maybe it helps them without as steep of a learning curve as what the old generation had. And that's what I would say is be kind to other farmers and share information and work together. Cause that's kind of tough to get into when you're surrounded by farmers that you're competing for the same land with. It just doesn't seem like there's really much exchange between local guys.
Yeah, that says a lot about you, Russell, and we really appreciate you being on the Whole Farm podcast today. We're going to close with that. Those were great. With that, we're going to close this episode. But for Les Riley, I'm Michael Pisciotta. Thank you, Russell Hedrick, for jumping on with us. Y'all have a blessed day. And as Russell Hedrick says, farm hard and pass it on. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening to the Whole Farm podcast by Chonex. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone in your network. For resources or to learn more about Chonex, visit chonex.ag. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.